And China, a country of immense history and rapid transformation, stands at the heart of tradition and modernity. It has become a global powerhouse, influencing everything from economics to technology, culture, and geopolitics. Today, China's dynamic evolution continues to captivate the world as it navigates challenges and embraces opportunities in the 21st century. Welcome to China Now, where past and present coverage and the future is being shaped with every passing moment. My name is Makiza Latifa, and we begin with China Currents, as we always do. Our host, Chris, is on standby to bring you stories that made headways this week. Our headline stories include China's preparation for war against the US, and the objective is quite clear: to prevent the United States from launching a second food war. The first of its kind, which it initiated in 2001. We'll tell you more shortly. Also, China has created history with Pakistan, and then China is projecting a big show in Japan. Stay with us for details of these and many more.
China Currents is a weekly news talk show from China to the world. We cover viral news about China every week and also give you the newest updates on China's cutting-edge technologies. Let's get started. Welcome to China Currents, your weekly news report on the latest developments in China. I'm Chris, and in this episode, China prepares for potential war against the United States. China makes history with Pakistan, and China projects a big show in Japan. First, let's head to the front line in the kitchen. On March 4th, Trump announced an additional 10% tariff on Chinese products on an original basis. China immediately announced an additional 15% tariff on a number of U.S. agricultural products, including soybeans. Reuters points out the tariffs are broadly negative for U.S. agricultural markets. It is going to have a bearish influence on prices. There are enough corn and soybean supplies in the world for China to make a switch. It is more of an issue for the U.S. because 30% of U.S. soybeans still goes to China. The U.S. will sow what they reap. On February 23rd, China unveiled its #1 central document for 2025, emphasizing the critical goal of strengthening self-sufficiency in domestic food production. The objective is clear: to prevent the United States from launching a second food war. The U.S. initiated the first food war against China in 2001. Though China ultimately prevailed, the staggering cost was unforgettable. Prior to joining the WTO in 2001, China faced relentless U.S. opposition. A key U.S. demand was unrestricted access to China's grain market, particularly for wheat and soybeans. With the U.S. holding veto power over China's WTO bid, Beijing faced a wrenching dilemma: reject the terms and forfeit WTO membership, which is critical for industrial growth and job creation, or compromise. China, home to 18% of the world's population but only 7% of its arable land, prioritized safeguarding staple food security. Reluctantly, it opened the soybean market while protecting wheat, a strategic trade-off. Soybeans, though essential for cooking oil and animal feed, were deemed less critical than wheat, a dietary staple. By 2003, surging demand drove imports to 18 million tons, surpassing domestic production. The U.S. Department of Agriculture repeatedly claimed that droughts have reduced soybean yields, causing global soybean prices to soar from $300 per ton to $600 per ton. As prices kept climbing, the USDA announced in 2004 that it would not increase soybean production, pushing prices past $750 per ton. This sparked panic among Chinese soybean oil companies, which rushed to sign massive purchase contracts with American grain traders, fearing prices would rise even further. But shortly after these deals were sealed, the USDA suddenly declared that its previous data was inaccurate. Following this news, global soybean prices plummeted back to $300 per ton. And for China, this was disastrous. The price manipulation wiped out many Chinese companies. Meanwhile, American agribusiness giants swooped in. Before the soybean war, China had about 1,000 soybean processing companies. By 2006, fewer than 30 remained, and over 70% of China's soybean trade was controlled by the US. The USDA's plan was even more insidious. It inflated soybean prices during China's planting season and then crashed the market during harvest time. Chinese farmers bought expensive soybean seeds at high prices only to lose all their money after a year of cultivation. This deliberate timing targeted China's poorest farmers, infuriated Beijing. In 2004, when US traders drove soybean prices to historic lows, attempting to crush Chinese farmers completely, the Chinese government intervened. State-owned China Grain Reserves Group, Sinograin, began stockpiling vast amounts of soybeans, secretly buying both domestic and imported soybeans. To this day, the exact size of Sinograin's 04-05 reserves remain unknown. Had American grain traders maintained a status quo, China's reserves might have stayed dormant. But in 2006, citing another natural disaster, US traders restricted soybean exports and pushed prices up again. This time, China struck back. When prices reached untenable levels, Sinograin began releasing its stockpiles in controlled manner, selling soybeans slightly below market rates every 10 days. And despite Sinograin's moves, US traders continued to push prices higher. China responded by accelerating its releases, shifting from 10 days intervals to weekly, then every 3 days. US traders, undeterred, continued limiting exports to sustain inflated prices. This standoff persisted until the 2008 global financial crisis ravaged markets across Europe and the US, dragging the grain market down with it. Only then did soybean prices collapse. Interestingly, just before the Beijing Olympics, Sinograin announced that China's soybean reserves had become excessive and partnered with livestock businesses to offload the surplus as animal feed. It was like a prolonged stalemate in a high-stakes race. Just as the American driver ran out of horsepower, the Chinese driver rolled down the window and quipped, "Time to shift into second gear." Global soybean prices spiraled downward and US agricultural giants conceded defeat, exiting the race. That victory not only protected Chinese farmers but also benefited US farmers indirectly. When China joined the WTO, the US seemed to suffer a natural disaster every few years, triggering soybean shortages. Yet after China demonstrated its massive reserves, those disasters mysteriously vanished. In recent years, China has expanded its soybean reserves and boosted domestic production. Techniques like intercropping soybeans with corn at optimal spacing have maximized land use and increased yields. Official data shows China's grain production has exceeded 650 million tons for 9 consecutive years, with soybean output stable at over 20 million tons. The United States, burdened by a $36 trillion national debt, has lost its edge over China in factories, battlefields, and financial warfare. Trump once mocked Zelensky for having no cards left to play, but the US itself is down to agriculture and biotechnology in its rivalry with China. Next, to space. On February 28th, China announced it will invite Pakistani astronauts to the Tiangong space station, marking the first time foreign crew members will board its independently developed orbital outpost. The collaboration involves selecting 5 Pakistani candidates, with 2 finalists undergoing rigorous training in China. One will join Chinese astronauts on a short-term mission to conduct experiments in biotechnology, microgravity research, and astronomy. Chinese officials highlighted that this aligns with the Belt and Road Initiative and Global South cooperation, lowering barriers for emerging countries in space exploration. Meanwhile, China is advancing its International Lunar Research Station, a joint lunar-based project with Russia and over a dozen countries, including Pakistan and the UAE, aiming for operational status by the 2030s. The ILRS will focus on resource utilization and deep space exploration, supported by the upcoming Chang'e 7 and Chang'e 8 missions. The exact launch date for the Pakistani astronauts remains unannounced, but we hope that by then NASA astronauts Sunita Williams and Barry Wilmore will no longer be stranded at the same altitude. Next up, Hello Tokyo! On February 27th, China's Strawberry Music Festival, one of the country's largest outdoor music events, announced it will debut in Japan on June 7th. This marks the festival's first venture outside China. The 2-day event will feature a diverse lineup of artists from China, Japan, and other Asian countries. Launched in 2009 by Modern Sky, a leading Chinese entertainment company, The Strawberry Music Festival debuted in Beijing and has since been held over 140 times across nearly 50 Chinese cities. More than 6,000 bands and artists from China and beyond have performed, attracting a cumulative audience of over 7.5 million. The festival's name has sparked speculation. Some believe it reflects a strawberry, a fruit tied to spring, diversity, romance, and love, mirroring the event's spirit. Others see it as a nod to the Beatles. After John Lennon's 1980 assassination outside the Dakota building, Yoko Ono funded a nearby memorial named Strawberry Fields, inspired by Lemon's 1967 song Strawberry Fields Forever. Whatever the truth, the festival has united music lovers across China, whether they prefer rock, pop, electronic, or hip-hop. The Yokohama Red Brick Warehouse, the festival's Japanese venture, carries its own historical weight. Since the 19th century, Yokohama has been a key trade hub for Tokyo, and the warehouse was originally built to store unprocessed goods arriving at the port. It witnessed Japan's rise as a global trading power and its modernization. Now, it will host a new chapter in music history as a Chinese festival debuts in Japan, fostering cultural exchange and musical prosperity across Asia. That's all for today, and thank you for joining me on this episode of China Currents. If you have any thoughts and comments, please reach us at the email address below. See you next time.
And that's all for China Currents with Chris. Next on the show, we delve into the Thinkers Forum, where ideas converge and the brightest minds come together to discuss the pressing issues of our time. This is a space for deep conversations, innovation, and insights as we explore the solutions and strategies that will shape the world of tomorrow. Stay tuned as we hear from our guest for today, Dr. Dussel Peters, who is a professor of the Graduate School of Economics, UNAM.
Look, surprisingly or not, maybe something similar is happening in China, but in Mexico, the harsh critiques and the blackmailing from President Trump vis-a-vis Mexico, among other countries, has unified a lot Mexicans. The polls for the Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum Pardo have improved substantially these weeks. No, the president has tried not to enter into a detailed discussion with President Trump, but she has always highlighted that we and she and the public sector in Mexico have to keep a cool head, not to engage in a daily discussion with the President of the United States. So it has unified Mexico. I expect that in the future, the Trump administration will continue pressing a lot of countries, and this is not a negotiation strategy, but a blackmail strategy. No? Either you do this, or I do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. No, don't you dare to take countermeasures, because if you are taking countermeasures on my tariffs, I will increase my original tariffs. No, so yes, I expect that the Trump administration in the next 4 years will continue with this strategy and will continue threatening lots of countries: Panama, Denmark, the European Union, China, Canada, Mexico, and all the countries you can imagine. They will continue with this strategy, and yes, they will impose new tariffs, as, by the way, they did, they will do on aluminum and steel, with new 25% tariffs to all countries of the world. The steel sector in Mexico generates around 700,000 jobs in Mexico, but more importantly are the so-called forward linkages of steel, which means steel is an input for dozens of other sectors, from auto parts, automobiles, machinery, but also telecommunications, shipbuilding, etc., etc. No, so 25% tariff is a deep cost for many firms established in Mexico. Mexico has surprisingly a trade deficit in steel with the United States. So, yes, Mexico exports steel to the United States, but we import more steel than we export with the United States. So, imposing a tariff would apparently not make too much sense, no? And secondly, the most important exporter of steel to the United States is by far Canada. Canada exports 41% of all steel imports of the United States. So the strongest affected and impacted country will be first Canada, and 10% of Mexican exports to the US are of steel. No, so yes, Mexico will be affected. And by the way, the main steel exporters from Mexico are foreign firms and mainly US firms. No, so tariffs, 25% tariffs, will mainly affect US firms established in Mexico. This makes the picture, if you want to, or the video, much more complicated than simply saying, I'm going to impose 25% tariffs on steel and aluminum. You know what? You are affecting your own firms, US firms established in Mexico. I believe it is very important to understand and to have two or three concepts to understand what has been going on in the United States in the last 5 to 10 years and what we will have to expect in the next 4 years of the Trump presidency. The first concept is new triangular relationships. Since 2017, Trump, in his first presidency, defined a great power competition between the United States and China. And since we are going to witness in the next years, and I believe in the next decades, this continuous confrontation between the United States and China, the two biggest economies of the world, the main topic will be how will third regions, Latin America, Africa, Asia, or countries, Vietnam, Mexico, Argentina, how will we react very pragmatically vis-a-vis hundreds of topics, no? From tourism to 5G to artificial intelligence, but also Confucius Institutes, no? And since 2022, what we have been analyzing in detail is the topic of security shoring. The United States, as a result of the profound competition between China and the United States, and in which China has been able to upgrade in terms of innovation, in terms of technology, as we have been witnessing in the last years, from Huawei to BYD to Deepscale and to lots of different firms that we will get to learn in the next years also. The United States, since 2022, very clearly highlights the main topic in our policy against China is our national security shoring. No? What does this mean? This means that issues such as trade, innovation, high-tech, semiconductors, electric vehicles, etc., will all be under the heading of national security. How does this affect our national interest and our national security? And by the way, fundamental for third countries. Mexico, will you integrate in our policy against China? or are you going to be against the United States? And this has been particularly clear in the last 3 weeks since the beginning of the Trump presidency regarding issues such as Greenland, such as the Panama Canal, and other topics. I remind you of the heading of the electoral process of Trump in the last months. But the topic that the President Trump has continuously highlighted, oriented to Republicans and probably some Democrats in the United States. The heading is MAGA, Make America Great Again. No? So it is a very conservative perspective. No? It's something like going back to the future. No, this MAGA expects to get back to the 1950s and 1960s in the 21st century. This is impossible, no? And this is impossible because, well, yes, in economic, technological, innovation terms, in the 1950s and 1960s, the United States has had an hegemonic power. Among other things, there is a small detail, and the country called China that is upgrading and already has the leadership in an important group of global value chains. And so MAGA is impossible to achieve. No, you cannot close your eyes and say, I don't see China. No, I don't see Huawei. I don't see BYD. I don't see what China has been achieving in the last decade and what probably China will achieve in the next decade. No, so MAGA is an impossible task, but it tells you very well what Trump wishes to do and expects to do in the next 4 years, no? And generating, by the way, massive uncertainty worldwide in terms of economics, politics, but also migration, etc. The prediction is that there is no prediction. No? We will have in the short term lots of executive orders, no? Like we have seen in the third 3 weeks, no? On February 1st, regarding Mexico and Canada, I will punish you in 1 month if you do not stop migration, if you do not stop fentanyl, if you do not do this. Best case scenario from a Canadian and Mexican perspective. Okay, we do comply with some of the topics relevant for the US at the beginning of March. You know what? In the beginning of March, new executive order. Now I request you to close all Confucius institutes in Canada and Mexico. I don't want to see them. If you do not comply with that, 15% tariffs, not in March, but in 1 month in April. Okay, Canada and Mexico closed all their Confucius institutes in April. You know what? I don't want to see Chinese investments. You have 1 month to close all Chinese investments in May. Otherwise, 15%. Okay, so I get rid of all Chinese investment. Note the irony, impossible. And in June, you know what? I don't want to see Chinese infrastructure in subways, in ports, in airports, in telecommunications. July, okay, you got rid of this. Now, this is a never-ending process, no? A never-ending process. Difficult. I think very strongly that in the short term, and this is already happening, all these executive orders will have legal limitations within the United States. No, some of them are completely illegal. No, so you will have different legal instances within the United States, and I believe you will have also a group of countries worldwide, BRICS, for example, that will say, you know what, stop with this. I will not enter any kind of discussions. This is not a negotiation. It's a blackmailing process. If you don't do what I want, I will do this, I will do that, etc. That's called blackmailing, not negotiation. So I foresee the next 6 months at least, they will be very, very difficult. And particularly for weaker countries and close to the United States, such as Latin America and Canada.
Right, let's still stay a bit further on the Thinkers Forum, but this time we are honored to welcome Shaun Rein, the founder of China Market Research Group, CMR, as one of the leading experts on China's economy and business landscape. Shaun will be offering his invaluable insights into the complex and ever-evolving competition between the United States and China. With his deep understanding of market trends and geopolitical dynamics, this conversation is sure to shed light on the forces shaping the global balance of power. Don't miss this engaging discussion.
So I believe in open and fair competition between the United States and China when it comes to AI. I think it's amazing that DeepSeek and then Alibaba both were able to create language learning models that were as good, if not better, than OpenAI's ChatGPT. What I'm kind of sad about is in the United States, you've seen a lot of tech bros. They view DeepSeek's release as a Sputnik moment. But instead of saying, let's outcompete the Chinese fairly, let's invest more in R&D, let's have more good minds on it, they're pushing Trump to try to put even more sanctions and even more expert controls on China. You see Eric Schmidt, the former CEO of Google, is saying we need to add even more export controls. Alexander Wang, who's also the founder of a big AI company, has also said we need to slap more sanctions on China. I think the reality is the Trump era, the Biden era, sanctions and tariffs have shot America in the foot. If they hadn't launched such sanctions, China probably wouldn't have focused so much on indigenous innovation. It's very clear that the CPC, it's very clear that Chinese companies are ultra focused on building up an indigenous innovation because they realize that they cannot rely on America or Europe for their technology supplies anymore. So even if a Chinese company wants to buy a chip from ASML or from Intel or NVIDIA, they're going to wonder, well, 4 years from now, are there going to be more sanctions? So instead of buying technology from America, they're going to build it all in-house. And this is really hurting the American technology sector and shooting America in the foot. You see that Intel, once one of the strongest semiconductors in the companies in the world, they're tottering on the brink of a takeover target. There's discussion that the Taiwanese company TSMC and Broadcom are going to split Intel into two. Now, part of it is because of poor innovation from Intel, but a large part of it is the last 4 or 5 years they've been banned from selling their advanced chips to Chinese clients. So this is just yet another example that containment policies don't work. Now, one of your previous guests, John Mearsheimer, has said he's 100% all in on trying to contain China. I think this is one of the most foolish, stupid policies that America could do. One, as I've shown, Chinese companies have invested so much on innovation themselves that they're now as good, if not better, than the United States. If America can build it, you can be sure that China eventually can too. It's either bigoted or stupid to say that Chinese can't catch up to Americans because China has the money, it has the government support, and it has the STEM intellectual brains to try to catch up. Two, it hurts American companies like Intel, like NVIDIA. You know, NVIDIA has said that now their former client, Huawei, is now one of their biggest competitors. So this was another mistake from the Mearsheimer school of thought of trying to contain China. And then third, you know, more importantly, when you look at the bigger picture, I think a lot of countries in the global south, I like to call them the global majority, they feel that the United States is bullying China. And they're worried that they too could be bullied. The United States went from being the liberators in the world, the good guys. They liberated the world from the Nazis. They liberated the world from a form of communism during the Soviet era that was not very productive economically. Now they're really almost like triads or mafia. They're forcing other countries to follow whatever the United States wants. And I think the global majority is angry at what the United States is doing. I'll give an example. Malaysia has invested billions and billions of dollars because they want to be a base or a locus for data centers. But in his last week as president, Biden slapped export bans on high-end semiconductor chips to Malaysia. And so Malaysia's plans over the last 5 years are gone. They might not be able to be a data center powerhouse because they're not able to get the high-end NVIDIA chips anymore because of Biden sanctions. So I think you're starting to see a deterioration of America's prestige, power, and dominance in the world because people view them as bullying China and bullying other countries like Malaysia. And that's why I start to see countries are starting to move closer to China's orbit. I was just in Saudi Arabia, and when you go to Saudi Arabia, they have investments from Huawei, from Alibaba, from BYD, all over the place. When you go into Singapore, BYD has replaced BMW and Toyota as the largest seller of autos in that country. So I think you see that the global South is gravitating towards China because they feel that China is going to emerge as a technology powerhouse, and China is not going to use economic coercion to stop selling high-end Huawei, high-end BYD technology to all these other countries, which is what the United States is doing. Now, I want to see China do well. I want to see the CPC do well. I'm almost 48 years old. I've lived the majority of my life in China. I would love to see the party and the country do well. But again, I'm also American. I would like to see the United States do well. And I don't think the US is going to do well if they continue to try to contain China, because we're not seen as the good guys anymore. We're seen as the bad guys who are using economic coercion. In many ways, under Biden and partially under Trump, we've become what we criticize China for being: bullying, oppression, economic coercion. So it might surprise a lot of Americans, but Chinese actually prefer Trump to Biden. There was a fear in China that we are entering a great age of ideological struggle. Biden was an ideologue. He felt that liberal democracies were superior to communist countries. And no matter what happened, you wouldn't be able to come to an understanding with Biden where both countries could grow peacefully together. And there was a fear that Harris and Waltz would be the same. Now, Harris was a little bit more of an unknown, but she was Biden's vice president. So there was a fear in China that if Harris and Waltz had won, they would be entering another 4 years, maybe 8 years of an ideological struggle. And that no matter what China did, simply because it was communist, simply because it was an emerging power, that the United States would try to contain it. With Trump, it's quite clear that he's not an ideologue. He's very transactional. You've seen he's criticized Panama, Mexico, and Canada, and now he's starting to criticize EU. He's slapping tariffs, slapping criticism, even on America's closest allies. So that actually lowers the tension with China. If Trump adds 10% or adds 60% tariffs, it doesn't seem like he's trying to destroy China. He's just trying to extract what he considers to be the best trade deal for America and probably for himself. With Trump, I think Chinese view that there's an opening. I'll give an example. Trump has said, I don't want Chinese NEV automakers to export from China autos into the United States. I want them to build factories in America, hire American workers, and help grow the economy of the United States. Frankly, that's fair, right? That's what the Chinese did to GM. That's what the Chinese did to Ford. That's what the Chinese did to Volkswagen in the 1990s. They said to foreign automakers, if you want to have access to China's growing, swelling middle class, you need to set up joint ventures and you need to set up factories in China. So I think it's fair if Trump, and frankly I think it's fair if Europe does the same to the BYDs, the NIOs, and the XPengs of the world and says if you want access to America and you want access to Europe, you need to invest in factories in these countries. The key is that Trump is offering a pathway to Chinese companies. With Biden, it was 100% tariff on Chinese NEVs, and it was 100% ban on Chinese NEVs and software. But that's basically a 100% ban because NEVs are basically mobile phones on wheels. You can't separate a Chinese car from their auto software because it's all incorporated together. So Biden basically was banning Chinese NEVs, which is one of China's new productive forces and key pillars for economic growth, from ever selling into the United States. While Trump is saying, build factories in America. That gives a pathway. It's the same thing with TikTok. You know, Biden wanted to ban TikTok completely. Trump is saying maybe if TikTok sells a 50% stake to American investors, we'll give an avenue. I'm actually cautiously optimistic over trade between the US and China under Trump, because at least Trump is giving a pathway to Chinese companies to start to invest and grow internationally without fears of sanctions. That's why in the last 2-3 weeks, especially after Xiaohongshu or Red's emergence, but especially after Trump's election, and even more after the emergence of DeepSeek and the release of DeepSeek, you've seen green shoots of optimism amongst China's 10%, or the movers and shakers, the wealthy people, and they're getting excited about investing. I also think that Trump is pragmatic, and he's going to see that US-China trade eventually is good for the American population. If you look at it, inflation is a major problem in the United States right now. Partially, it's because of what I consider to be an irresponsibly loose monetary policy by the Fed in the last 5 years during the COVID era, where we've added almost 18 trillion to the American deficit. Part of it is because of high energy prices from Russia, because of the Russia-Ukraine war. But a large part of it is tariffs. You know, it's no surprise that there's major inflation in the United States when there's tariffs on $350 billion worth of Chinese-made goods. I'm hopeful that Trump is going to realize the pragmatism. If you look at it, in the United States, the average SUV costs $43,000. The average sedan costs $38,000. BYD, a Chinese NEV maker, just announced that their $9,000 model is going to have full autonomous driving as good, if not better, than Tesla. Wouldn't it be great for the everyday Americans if they could buy a $9,000 car from BYD, and that would help solve the massive inflation problem that's hitting the United States? So I see that there's tension between the US and China. That's what I outlined in my book, The Split. You know, everybody has to get used to geopolitical tension over the next 10, 20 years. But I'm hopeful that under Trump, that an accommodation can be made, that a trade deal can be made. I'm not sure it's going to happen in year 1. I'm not sure it's going to happen in year 2 or even in year 3. But Trump has a pathological need to say that he got a trade deal and he beat the Chinese. And I think he's going to say that to the American population, even if it's not really a defeat of China, but it's more of a win-win deal. So Trump wants to bring manufacturing back to the United States. Now, this is symbolic, but there's also some legitimate reasons for this. One, to create more jobs in the United States. But I actually think this is a red herring, right? The United States economy is strong. You can hear Trump talk about how unemployment is so low. So does he really need the manufacturing to come back to the United States from an employment situation? The answer is no. There's more than enough jobs in the United States right now. Second, I do think that it's needed from a geopolitical strategy. But purely from a geopolitical standpoint, it makes sense for the United States to have more manufacturing of key industries in America or in their allies, just in case tensions between the US and China go bad. You can't have all of your antibiotics, right? 95% of the world's antibiotics come from China. It doesn't make sense that you have all of the antibiotics in the world in a country that is a competitor, that is an adversary. It's not in the United States. Companies like drones. Right now, DJI, a Chinese drone company, dominates the US sector for drones for public safety, which I think is a mistake. There's a great opportunity for an American company to set up drones. You know, my son, Tom Rein, has set up a drone company, and he wants to make drones for Americans by Americans because it's important that America has drones made in the United States, as well as antibiotics. So I think that Trump talking about bringing manufacturing back to the United States for employment is mostly a red herring. That's something that talks well to the electorate, but doesn't make a lot of sense. But for some sectors that are more national security key areas, it does make sense to bring manufacturing back to the United States. I don't want a war and I don't want tension between the US and China. Again, I love both countries, but the reality is you have to plan. Don't exaggerate the risks, don't fearmonger, but you have to make sure that you can take care of yourself in case the bad case scenarios happen. The biggest risk going forward right now from a manufacturing and tariffs is not China, right? Only about 2.5% of China's GDP is based off of exports to the US. In 2017, about 18% of China's exports went to the US. That's gone down to 14%. So China has smartly de-risked from the US. Again, I don't want to see tension between the two countries, but it didn't make sense that China was beholden to America by exporting too much of their products. So they've now gone off into the global south, which is why I think China is better able to withstand a trade war during Trump's second administration than they were during the first administration. The greater risk right now, frankly, is for Vietnam. So many countries moved from China to Vietnam over the last 7 years that a huge percentage of Vietnam's GDP is actually geared towards exports towards the United States. So if I was advising the president or the party secretary general of Vietnam, I would tell them you need to de-risk from the US. Unfortunately, the world is such now that globalization, there's sort of anti-globalization trends. So all countries, whether it be the US, China, Vietnam, anywhere, has to make sure that they're not too exposed by selling too many of their products or too many of their services to one single country in case tension erupts or in case a black swan event like COVID happens again.
And as we wrap up today's episode of China Now, we thank you for joining us on this exploration of China's dynamic landscape. From technological advancement to cultural insights, we've delved into the multifaceted developments shaping the nation. My name is Makiza Latifa. Stay tuned for our next edition, where we'll continue to bring you the latest updates and in-depth analysis from China. Until then, keep informed and engaged with the evolving story of this remarkable country.